Dearest listeners, there exists no greater folly than a gentleman who mistakes the beating of his own heart for mere indigestion, particularly when that heart belongs to a rake of the first order who has spent years perfecting the art of avoiding such inconvenient sensations entirely. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most vexing tale of Lord Tristan Caldwell, second son of the illustrious Marquis of Winterbourne, and Miss Imogen Bellwether, a young lady whose greatest crime against society was possessing both an exceptional mind and a figure that did not conform to the preferences for a diaphanous slenderness so in vogue in the finest drawing rooms. And before we delve into this delicious torment, if the prospect already intrigues you, I ask that you show your appreciation and follow this chronicle, thus ensuring you shall not miss a single detail of what is to come. For the best stories, like a delicate embroidery, must be unfurled thread by thread, allowing each silken stitch to find its place before the magnificent final design is revealed. Lord Tristan Caldwell had cultivated his reputation as a libertine with the same dedication other gentlemen applied to their curricle racing or their morning constitutional in Hyde Park. At 26, he possessed the kind of devastating handsomeness that made mothers of impressionable daughters cross themselves while simultaneously calculating his annual income. Dark hair that perpetually appeared as though he had just risen from bed, which in truth he often had, framed features that bore the aristocratic stamp of centuries of careful breeding. His gray eyes held the cynical gleam of a man who had sampled every pleasure London's more questionable establishments could provide, and his smile carried the promise of delicious ruin. He recalled briefly the lace handkerchief forgotten by a baroness in his chambers the previous evening, a trophy so trivial that he had already nearly forgotten it, and felt a familiar ennui settle over him like morning mist. The second son of a marquess enjoyed certain privileges that his elder brother, the dutiful heir apparent, could never claim. Whilst Reginald concerned himself with estate management and parliamentary duties, Tristan had been free to pursue what he termed his extensive education in the humanities, a curriculum that included the finest French wines, the most expensive courtesans, and every gaming hell from St. James's to the seedier establishments south of the Thames. His apartments in Jermyn Street were testament to this hedonism, where books of philosophy competed with empty wine bottles from parties that stretched until dawn, the hour when Tristan frequently retired, only to emerge again in the afternoon and resume the cycle at White's or Boodle's, holding court among fellow reprobates until the evening's entertainments beckoned once more. The system had served him admirably for the better part of a decade. He possessed sufficient funds to maintain his lifestyle without resorting to anything so vulgar as trade or, heaven forbid, seeking a wealthy wife. His charm opened doors that should, by all rights, have remained firmly closed to a gentleman of his reputation. The Ton's matrons might tut-tut disapprovingly when he appeared at social functions, but their unmarried daughters found mysterious reasons to linger in his vicinity, drawn like moths to a flame that promised to consume them utterly. It was, therefore, with considerable incredulity that Tristan received his father's summons on a particularly disagreeable morning in early spring. The Marquis of Winterbourne rarely troubled himself with his second son's activities, having long ago resigned himself to Tristan's determined pursuit of dissolution. The terse note, delivered by a groom whose expression suggested he had ridden hard from the family seat in Gloucestershire, contained but a single line demanding his immediate presence at Winterbourne Hall on a matter of utmost importance. Tristan studied the familiar handwriting with the same attention he might have devoted to a particularly challenging hand of piquet. His father's correspondence typically consisted of quarterly reminders of his disappointment in his younger son's lifestyle, delivered with the mechanical precision of a church bell marking the hours. This departure from established pattern suggested something altogether more serious was afoot. The journey to Winterbourne Hall required the better part of 2 days, a tedious exercise in dramatic speculation, his imagination conjuring everything from his brother's death to the family's financial ruin. The truth, however, would prove far more mundane and infinitely worse. The truth when it was finally revealed in the imposing library that had intimidated him since childhood, proved far worse than financial ruin or fraternal demise. "Marriage," the Marquis announced without preamble, his weathered features set in lines of implacable determination. The time had come for his younger son to fulfill his duty to this family and take a wife. Tristan, who had been examining a particularly fine first edition of Paradise Lost whilst bracing himself for whatever unpleasant revelation awaited, nearly dropped the precious volume. The older man's voice carried the authority of one accustomed to absolute obedience as he explained that he had tolerated his son's disgraceful conduct in London for far too long. The family name suffered with each fresh scandal, and it would end immediately. The Marquis rose from behind his massive desk, every inch of his bearing radiating aristocratic resolve. His son would return to society, comport himself as befitted his station, and select a suitable bride before the season concluded. The choice of lady was his, provided she met the basic requirements of birth and breeding. When Tristan protested regarding his brother's eventual marriage providing sufficient heirs, the older man dismissed such concerns with cold logic. Wives might produce only daughters, and the succession must be secured beyond doubt. The ultimatum was delivered with devastating clarity: marriage or complete disinheritance. The allowance would cease immediately, the apartments would be surrendered, and the debts would remain his own concern. In short, he would learn the true meaning of independence without family support. Tristan's mind raced through his limited options with the desperate efficiency of a cornered fox. His quarterly allowance, whilst generous, had never been sufficient to cover his expenses entirely. He possessed a modest inheritance from his maternal grandmother, but it would hardly sustain his current lifestyle for more than a few months. Pride forbade him from seeking assistance from friends who might view his predicament as justice long overdue. The Marquis resumed his seat with the satisfied air of a chess master announcing checkmate. The local gentry would be gathering for the usual round of spring entertainments. Lady Fairfax had already indicated her intention to host several events at Fairfax Manor. His son would attend, conduct himself with appropriate dignity, and select a bride from among the eligible young ladies present. When Tristan protested that he could hardly expect to find suitable companionship among the provincial misses of Gloucestershire society, his father's expression softened slightly, revealing the first hint of paternal concern beneath his determined facade. Young ladies raised in the country possessed virtues that their London counterparts frequently lacked: modesty, domestic accomplishment, and moral rectitude, to name but a few. Perhaps removal from London's corrupting influences would remind him of qualities he once possessed. And so it was that Lord Tristan Caldwell found himself installed in his childhood chambers at Winterbourne Hall, contemplating a future that stretched before him with all the appeal of a lengthy sermon delivered by a particularly tedious vicar. The irony was not lost on him that a man who had spent years perfecting the art of seduction now faced the prospect of courting respectable young ladies whose greatest excitement might be an extra sugar cake at afternoon tea. He could, of course, choose exile and poverty over matrimonial servitude. The continent beckoned with promises of freedom and adventure, provided one possessed sufficient funds to enjoy them properly. But pride, that most aristocratic of failings, rebelled against such an admission of defeat. If his father wished to witness his transformation into a model of respectability, then by God, he would provide such a performance as to make Drury Lane's finest actors weep with envy. The decision, once made, brought a curious sense of relief. He would play the role of reformed rake seeking domestic bliss, court whichever unfortunate young lady seemed most likely to accept his suit, and endure whatever tedious ceremony was required to satisfy his father's demands. Afterwards, surely some arrangement could be reached that would allow both parties to pursue their separate interests whilst maintaining the appearance of matrimonial harmony. It never occurred to him, in those first days of reluctant acceptance, that the heart he had considered safely armored against all sentiment might prove vulnerable to precisely the sort of genuine affection he had spent years avoiding. Love, after all, was a weakness he had successfully overcome through dedicated application to less demanding pleasures. How very wrong he was destined to discover himself to be. The first assembly of the spring season at Fairfax Manor arrived with all the fanfare typically accorded to such events in a county where entertainment options remained decidedly limited. Lady Fairfax, a formidable matron whose enthusiasm for matchmaking rivaled Napoleon's passion for conquest, had spared no expense in transforming her ballroom into what she proclaimed a temple to Terpsichore herself. Hothouse flowers adorned every available surface, their exotic perfumes competing with the more familiar scents of beeswax candles and the various pomades favored by the assembled gentlemen. The air hung heavy with the stifling warmth of hundreds of flames and dancing bodies, whilst the sound of the chamber orchestra from the gallery above competed with the ceaseless hum of conversation and muffled laughter, creating a cacophony of social celebration. The musicians, imported at considerable expense from Bath, had positioned themselves in the gallery overlooking the dance floor, their instruments gleaming in the warm glow of dozens of chandeliers. Tristan arrived fashionably late, a habit so ingrained that he would have struggled to appear punctually even had his life depended upon it. His appearance caused the predictable flutter among the local matrons, who had been anticipating this moment since news of his return had spread through the neighborhood with the swiftness of fire through dry bracken. He cut an imposing figure in his evening attire, the stark black and white of his coat and breeches serving to emphasize both his height and the breadth of his shoulders. A single ruby adorned his snowy cravat, its deep red gleam echoing the subtle embroidery on his waistcoat. His dark hair had been arranged in the latest London style, though a few rebellious strands had already escaped to frame his face in a manner that suggested both elegance and a certain dangerous unpredictability. The ritual of introduction proceeded with agonizing predictability. Lady Fairfax descended upon him like a ship of the line engaging an enemy vessel, her formidable bosom heaving with excitement as she prepared to present her collection of eligible daughters and nieces. Each young lady curtsied with varying degrees of grace, whilst their mammas hovered nearby, calculating marriage settlements with the efficiency of Lombard Street bankers. Miss Charlotte Fairfax, the hostess's eldest daughter, possessed the sort of classical beauty that graced the pages of La Belle Assemblée. Golden ringlets framed features of porcelain perfection, whilst her figure displayed the fashionable slenderness that suggested either excellent breeding or a carefully managed diet. She performed her curtsy with practiced elegance, her blue eyes sparkling with the sort of calculated charm that comes from years of careful instruction in the art of husband hunting. Miss Araminta Thornfield, recently returned from a London season that had failed to produce the desired result, attempted to compensate for this disappointment through an excess of animated conversation punctuated by musical laughter that carried clearly across the ballroom. Her gown, whilst undoubtedly expensive, bore the unmistakable stamp of a modiste, more concerned with following fashion than understanding what might flatter her particular figure. After Miss Thornfield, the parade of rehearsed smiles and conversation about watercolors continued, and Tristan responded with the polished charm of a well-oiled automaton, internally cataloging the candidates according to their potential suitability for his purposes. Miss Fairfax would undoubtedly prove a popular choice, her beauty and her mother's social connections ensuring their union would be celebrated as the match of the season. Miss Thornfield's family possessed sufficient wealth to overcome any lingering concerns about her failure to secure a London husband. Several others displayed the sort of biddable nature that would ensure domestic tranquility whilst requiring minimal emotional investment on his part. It was whilst mentally arranging these matrimonial candidates in order of preference that he became aware of a disturbance in the corner of the ballroom where the less prominent guests had been relegated to observe the proceedings. A cluster of elderly ladies had formed around someone whose identity remained concealed by their substantial forms, their voices carrying the distinctive flutter of indignation barely contained within the bounds of politeness. One dowager declared in tones that suggested personal affront that such shocking behavior should never be displayed at a public assembly. Another added with barely concealed satisfaction that the poor mamma must be mortified beyond endurance, though she dare say she brought this upon herself by failing to provide proper guidance. A third voice contributed that the gel had always been peculiar, too much reading having addled her brains something dreadful. Curiosity, that fatal flaw that had led him into numerous uncomfortable situations over the years, compelled Tristan to drift closer to the source of such scandalous commentary. As he approached, the circle of disapproving matrons parted slightly, revealing the object of their collective displeasure. Miss Imogen Bellwether sat alone upon a small gilt chair that had clearly been positioned to remove her from the general company, whilst avoiding the outright rudeness of exclusion entirely. Her dark hair, rather than being arranged in the elaborate coiffures favored by her contemporaries, had been simply dressed and adorned with a modest ribbon that matched her gown. That gown itself represented a clear departure from current fashion, its deep sapphire silk cut in lines that emphasized rather than concealed the generous curves of her figure. But it was not her unconventional appearance that had attracted such censorious attention. Miss Bellwether held in her lap a slim volume bound in Morocco leather, and she was reading with the sort of absorbed concentration typically reserved for matters of life and death. Even more shocking, she appeared to be making notes in the margins with a pencil she had presumably concealed about her person for precisely this purpose. The sight was so unexpected, so utterly contrary to every rule governing proper behavior at social gatherings, that Tristan found himself staring with unabashed fascination. Young ladies of good breeding simply did not read at assemblies. They certainly did not write in books. Most shocking of all, they never, under any circumstances, displayed such obvious indifference to the opinions of their social superiors. As if sensing his scrutiny, Miss Bellwether glanced up from her book, her dark eyes meeting his with a directness that would have made a more conventional young lady blush and look away immediately. Instead, she regarded him with calm assessment, her expression suggesting neither the simpering encouragement he had grown accustomed to receiving from marriageable females, nor the calculating evaluation that had characterized his evening thus far. For a moment that stretched far longer than propriety should have allowed, they simply looked at one another across the crowded ballroom. Her face, whilst not possessing the classical perfection that graced the pages of fashion periodicals, held an intelligent animation that spoke of thoughts worth discovering. Her complexion bore the healthy glow of someone who spent time out of doors without benefit of parasol or veil, and her mouth curved in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Then someone jostled his elbow, breaking the spell that had held him momentarily transfixed. When he looked again, Miss Bellwether had returned to her reading, her attention apparently absorbed once more by whatever literary work had proved more engaging than the evening's festivities. Lady Fairfax appeared at his side with the silent efficiency of a well-trained servant, observing that he had noticed their little bluestocking. Her tone carried the sort of amused tolerance typically reserved for harmless eccentrics as she explained that poor dear Imogen possessed a perfectly respectable lineage, but persisted in these peculiar habits despite her dear mamma's best efforts. The gel had read every book in her father's library, Lady Fairfax continued with evident disapproval. Sir Barnaby encouraged her, the foolish man, though what good it would do her no one could fathom. She would end her days as companion to some elderly relative, mark her words. Such a pity, really. She might have been quite tolerable if only she had applied herself to more suitable pursuits. The conversation was interrupted by the commencement of the first dance, and Tristan found himself obligated to lead Miss Charlotte Fairfax onto the floor. She proved an accomplished dancer, her steps perfectly executed, and her conversation appropriately light. She spoke of the weather and the beauty of the decorations, complimented his dancing, and expressed hope that he was finding the local society agreeable after the sophistication of London. Yet throughout the intricate figures of the country dance, Tristan's attention kept wandering to the corner where Miss Bellwether remained absorbed in her book. Once, when the movements of the dance brought him close enough to observe her clearly, he noticed that she appeared to be reading poetry, her lips moving slightly as if testing the rhythm of the verses upon her tongue. the discovery should not have intrigued him as much as it did. He had known dozens of women who proclaimed their devotion to literature, though their enthusiasm typically extended no further than the latest Gothic novel or perhaps a volume of improving sermons. The sight of a young lady grappling seriously with what appeared to be serious verse struck him as sufficiently unusual to warrant further investigation. When the dance concluded, he escorted Miss Fairfax back to her mother with appropriate gallantry, endured another round of introductions to eager young ladies, and finally managed to extricate himself from the press of aspiring dancers long enough to approach the literary corner where Miss Bellwether held court with her book. He offered the sort of bow that acknowledged her station whilst maintaining his own superior rank, addressing her by name though they had not been formally introduced. She glanced up again, and this time he was close enough to observe that her eyes were not merely dark, but a rich brown that held flecks of gold in their depths. She confessed herself surprised that he knew her name, given their lack of formal introduction. But her voice carried the cultured accents of good breeding, with something that suggested amusement rather than the fluttered excitement that typically greeted his attentions. More intriguingly, she made no move to close her book or otherwise acknowledge that his presence required any alteration in her behavior. When he pleaded guilty to the impropriety whilst noting that her reputation as a scholar preceded her, she replied with what was definitely a smile that she had hoped her scandalous devotion to learning might remain their little secret here in deepest Gloucestershire. The words might have been spoken by any young lady attempting to demonstrate her wit, but there was something in her delivery that suggested genuine humor rather than mere social performance. She spoke as if she genuinely found the situation amusing rather than mortifying, and her complete lack of concern for the disapproving glances directed their way struck him as either remarkably brave or thoroughly reckless. When he inquired what literary work had proved sufficient to tempt her away from the evening's festivities, she replied without hesitation that she was reading Byron. She confessed herself quite overcome by the passion of his verses, though she suspected admitting such enthusiasm marked her as thoroughly improper. Tristan felt something shift within his chest, a sensation so unfamiliar that he initially mistook it for the onset of indigestion brought on by Lady Fairfax's ambitious dinner menu. No young lady of his acquaintance had ever voluntarily mentioned Byron in mixed company, much less admitted to finding passion in his work. The poets favored by respectable society tended toward the safely inspirational variety whose verses might be recited in drawing rooms without causing elderly aunts to require smelling salts. His inquiry regarding which particular work had captured her attention so completely brought the response that she was reading Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, though she suspected she should claim to be reading something more improving, such as Mrs. Hannah More's latest moral treatise. When he expressed heartfelt disapproval of such tedious options, she laughed, not the musical titter that had echoed across the ballroom all evening, but a genuine expression of mirth that transformed her entire countenance. Her observation that most gentlemen of her acquaintance professed great admiration for whatever book their current dancing partner claimed to favor, regardless of their own opinions on the matter, prompted his honest assessment that such men were fools. The rudeness of the statement caused him to beg her pardon, but she replied serenely that his assessment was accurate, whilst confessing curiosity as to what brought such a noted connoisseur of London's more sophisticated pleasures to their humble rural gathering. The question, delivered with perfect composure, nonetheless carried an undercurrent of challenge that intrigued him far more than it should have. She knew his reputation, that much was clear from her phrasing, yet she showed no sign of either the moral disapproval or the fascinated attraction that typically greeted such knowledge. When he replied truthfully that filial duty had brought him to Gloucestershire, she nodded as if this explained everything, observing that they were both, it seemed, prisoners of family expectations. There was something in her tone that suggested personal experience with such imprisonment, though he could not imagine what family expectations might constrain the behavior of a country squire's daughter beyond the usual requirements of respectability and domestic accomplishment. Her explanation, when he pressed for details, revealed that her dear papa had decreed this would be her final season in local society, before she accepted the inevitable fate of confirmed spinsterhood. She confessed herself torn between relief and resignation, relief that she would finally be free to pursue her studies without the pretense that she might yet transform herself into the sort of biddable creature some gentleman might wish to marry. When he inquired about his own domestic arrangements, she asked with curious directness what domestic angel his family had selected to reform his wicked ways. The question should have been impertinent, yet somehow her delivery made it seem merely curious. When he explained that the selection remained his to make, though the deadline approached with alarming rapidity, she observed with unexpected insight that it sounded like a condemned man permitted to choose his own method of execution. Tristan felt a sharp pang of irony. Here was a young lady marked as thoroughly improper for reading about the passions of a notorious poet, conversing with a man whose own life could fill a volume of even greater scandal. Before he could formulate a response to this unexpected observation, the music swelled to announce the supper dance, and Lady Fairfax materialized beside them with the inexorable force of a Mediterranean storm. The dismissal was politely phrased, but unmistakable in its intent, and Tristan found himself swept away to partner Miss Araminta Thornfield in the final dance of the evening. Yet throughout the remaining festivities, his thoughts returned again and again to the young lady who had preferred Byron to ballroom conversation, who spoke of marriage as execution and spinsterhood as freedom, and whose dark eyes had assessed him with an intelligence that found no need to disguise itself behind flutter and simpering. For the first time in his adult life, Lord Tristan Caldwell found himself genuinely curious about a respectable young lady's thoughts. The sensation was both novel and deeply unsettling. The morning following Lady Fairfax's assembly dawned with the sort of crystalline clarity that transforms even the most familiar landscape into something approaching the sublime. Tristan emerged from his chambers considerably earlier than was his custom, driven by a restlessness that defied rational explanation. Sleep had proven elusive, his dreams populated by dark eyes and intelligent conversation that bore no resemblance to the vapid exchanges that typically characterized such social gatherings. His usual remedy for such unsettled moods involved a vigorous ride across the countryside surrounding Winterbourne Hall. The morning air, crisp with the promise of spring, proved sufficiently invigorating to clear his head of whatever romantic nonsense had taken root there during the previous evening's festivities. Or so he informed himself as he directed his mount toward the network of bridle paths that crisscrossed the estate. It was whilst following one such path that he encountered Sir Barnaby Bellwether mounted upon a sturdy bay mare that appeared to have been selected for reliability rather than elegance. The older gentleman possessed the sort of weathered countenance that spoke of decades spent managing his modest estate without benefit of steward or other such expensive luxuries. His morning attire, whilst perfectly respectable, bore the practical touches of a man who viewed clothing as protection from the elements rather than advertisement of his social position. Sir Barnaby greeted him with the hearty bonhomie that characterized his dealings with his social superiors, expressing delight at encountering him abroad at such an early hour. He confessed himself surprised to discover that London's sophisticated pleasures had not entirely eliminated his appreciation for country mornings. Their conversation naturally turned to the previous evening's entertainment, Sir Barnaby providing amusing commentary on Lady Fairfax's ambitious decorations, whilst noting with obvious pride that his wife had delivered a detailed account of the proceedings over their breakfast table. It seemed that Tristan had made quite an impression upon the local young ladies, though he understood that his lordship had also made the acquaintance of his peculiar daughter. The mention of Miss Bellwether produced an unexpected quickening of Tristan's pulse, a physiological response that he attempted to dismiss as the natural result of vigorous exercise. When he described her as quite refreshing, Sir Barnaby laughed heartily, suggesting that this represented the most diplomatic description of Imogen's unconventional behavior that he was likely to hear from any gentleman brave enough to approach her corner of the ballroom. Tristan's observation that she seemed remarkably well-read for a young lady prompted the correction that she was remarkably well-read for anyone. The gel had consumed every volume in his library and begun making alarming requests for works that no respectable bookseller would consider stocking. Sir Barnaby confessed himself torn between admiration for her intellect and concern for her marriage prospects. The conversation provided an opportunity to satisfy his curiosity about the enigmatic Miss Bellwether without appearing overly interested in her personal circumstances. When Tristan suggested that surely her accomplishments would appeal to a gentleman seeking more substantial conversation than watercolor techniques and Italian songs, Sir Barnaby agreed whilst expressing considerable doubt on this point. Unfortunately, the sort of gentleman who appreciated intellectual discourse in a wife tended to seek it in combination with either extraordinary beauty or extraordinary fortune. Poor Imogen possessed neither in sufficient quantity to overcome her reputation as a bluestocking. Sir Barnaby's expression grew thoughtful when Tristan observed that her reputation seemed rather exaggerated based upon their brief conversation. The older gentleman's response proved illuminating regarding the true extent of his daughter's unconventional pursuits. Yesterday morning, he had discovered her in his study engaged in correspondence with a professor at Oxford regarding some obscure point of classical translation. Last week, she had requested permission to attend a lecture on natural philosophy being delivered in Cheltenham, arguing that the advancement of scientific knowledge transcended the usual restrictions governing feminine behavior. Tristan found himself genuinely impressed despite his better judgment. The Oxford correspondence suggested intellectual pursuits far beyond the typical accomplishments expected of well-bred young ladies, whilst the natural philosophy lecture indicated a breadth of interests that would intimidate most gentlemen of his acquaintance. When he inquired whether Sir Barnaby permitted such activities, the older man spread his hands in a gesture of helpless affection. How could he not? She was the light of his life, and her happiness mattered far more to him than society's narrow definitions of appropriate feminine behavior. Though he confessed himself concerned about her future once he was no longer there to protect her from the consequences of her unconventional nature, the genuine affection in Sir Barnaby's voice was unmistakable, and Tristan felt an unexpected pang of something that might have been envy. His own father's interest in his welfare extended no further than ensuring he fulfilled his dynastic obligations with minimum scandal to the family name. Tristan's suggestion that she seemed perfectly capable of managing her own affairs prompted Sir Barnaby's observation that this was precisely what worried him. A woman of independent mind required either independent means or a husband willing to appreciate rather than suppress her unusual qualities. He could provide neither in sufficient measure. The implications of this observation settled over Tristan with uncomfortable clarity. Miss Bellwether's future options appeared to be limited to accepting whatever husband might overlook her intellectual pursuits in favor of her modest dowry, or resigning herself to the dependent status of unmarried daughter and eventual aunt to her more conventional relations. Sir Barnaby's explanation of their domestic circumstances revealed that his estate, while sufficient to maintain the family in modest comfort, provided little in the way of surplus for marriage settlements or independent establishments. Imogen's portion would be respectable but hardly generous, and her unconventional reputation ensured that she could not depend upon her personal charms to overcome such financial limitations. They had reached a fork in the bridle path, where their routes necessarily diverged. Sir Barnaby toward his own modest estate, and Tristan back toward Winterbourne Hall. As they prepared to part company, the older gentleman fixed him with a look that suggested far more perception than his genial manner typically revealed. He hoped Tristan would not think him presumptuous, but he could not help observing his apparent interest in his daughter's conversation the previous evening. Whilst he appreciated any kindness shown to her, he felt obligated to mention that Imogen had little experience with gentlemen of his extensive reputation. He should hate for her to mistake polite attention for something more significant. The warning was delivered with perfect courtesy, but its meaning was unmistakable. Sir Barnaby had recognized the potential for his daughter to develop an attachment to a gentleman whose matrimonial intentions lay elsewhere, and he sought to protect her from the inevitable disappointment such an attachment would bring. The remainder of Tristan's ride passed in contemplation of this unexpected encounter and its implications. He had intended merely to clear his head of whatever romantic foolishness had disturbed his sleep, yet he found himself in possession of information that made Miss Bellwether's situation seem even more intriguing than her conversation had suggested. The notion of a young lady constrained by financial circumstances whilst possessing intellectual gifts that exceeded those of most gentlemen struck him as fundamentally unjust. More troubling still was the recognition that his own situation bore uncomfortable similarities to hers. Both were trapped by family expectations and limited options, forced to accept marriages of convenience rather than pursuing their natural inclinations. Upon returning to Winterbourne Hall, he discovered that the morning's post had brought several invitations that would provide additional opportunities to encounter local society. Lady Thornfield requested the pleasure of his company at an evening of musical entertainment, whilst Mrs. Hartwell proposed a picnic party that would showcase her daughter's accomplishments in watercolor painting. Most intriguingly, Sir Barnaby had extended an invitation to dine en famille at Bellwether Manor, suggesting that the morning's conversation had not entirely discouraged his interest in furthering their acquaintance. The latter invitation presented certain complications that Tristan had not anticipated. Dining with a family in their private residence implied a level of serious intent that mere ballroom conversation could not convey. Sir Barnaby's warning regarding his daughter's inexperience with sophisticated gentlemen suggested that any attention shown to her would be interpreted as evidence of matrimonial interest. Yet the prospect of engaging Miss Bellwether in extended conversation without the constraints imposed by public assemblies appealed to him far more than it should have. Their brief exchange at Lady Fairfax's gathering had provided tantalizing glimpses of an intellect that might prove genuinely entertaining rather than merely decoratively accomplished. The dinner invitation at Bellwether Manor presented a dilemma. Prudence dictated that he should focus on more conventional candidates like the beautiful Miss Fairfax or the wealthy Miss Thornfield. Yet the prospect of another evening of insipid conversation about fashion and gossip bored him profoundly. The memory of Miss Bellwether's sharp intelligence proved a stronger temptation than good sense, and he found himself composing a note of acceptance whilst telling himself he was merely exploring all available options. If he was destined to marry for duty rather than inclination, surely he owed it to himself to explore all available options before making his final selection. The fact that such exploration might prove personally enjoyable was merely an unexpected bonus in what promised to be an otherwise tedious process. Or so he informed himself as he sealed the note and dispatched it via groom to Bellwether Manor. The lie came easily enough that he almost believed it himself. The evening appointed for dining at Bellwether Manor arrived accompanied by precisely the sort of gentle spring rain that transforms country roads into ribbons of mud and renders careful attention to one's attire an exercise in futility. Tristan contemplated postponing the engagement, a decision that would have been both practical and prudent given the deplorable conditions. Instead, he found himself taking unusual care with his appearance, selecting a coat of midnight blue superfine that complemented his coloring whilst remaining appropriately understated for a family dinner. His cravat received the sort of attention he typically reserved for appearances at Almack's, and he dismissed his valet's initial efforts twice before achieving the precise combination of elegance and carelessness that suggested a gentleman who dressed well without appearing to exert excessive effort in the pursuit. The journey to Bellwether Manor proved as treacherous as anticipated, his curricle wheels sliding through muddy ruts that threatened to deposit both vehicle and occupant in the nearest hedgerow. By the time he reached the modest estate, evening shadows had begun to gather, and the warm glow emanating from the manor's windows provided a welcome beacon through the steadily increasing rainfall. Bellwether Manor itself reflected the comfortable gentility of a family possessed of ancient lineage but modest means. The building bore the pleasing proportions of Elizabethan architecture, its mellow stone facade speaking of centuries of careful maintenance rather than expensive renovation. Ivy had been permitted to climb the walls in artful profusion, and the gardens visible through the rain showed evidence of more enthusiasm than professional expertise in their cultivation. Sir Barnaby greeted his arrival with genuine warmth, accepting his apologies for tardiness with the understanding of a country gentleman familiar with the vagaries of rural transportation. Lady Bellwether proved to be a gentle creature whose faded beauty and anxious manner suggested someone perpetually concerned that her domestic arrangements might fall short of her guests' expectations. She expressed delight that he could join them despite the dreadful weather whilst wringing her hands and casting worried glances toward the dining room. She hoped Cook had managed the fish properly, for country kitchens were so unpredictable, and she knew gentlemen accustomed to London's superior establishments must find their simple fare quite inadequate. Tristan's assurance that he found himself quite weary of London's excessive refinements had its desired effect, Lady Bellwether's anxious expression softening into something approaching relief. Simple fare prepared with care, he insisted, often surpassed elaborate dishes created merely for display. Sir Barnaby, observing this exchange with obvious satisfaction, gestured toward the drawing room where they might await the dinner announcement in greater comfort. It was there that Tristan encountered Miss Bellwether arrayed in evening attire that confirmed his growing suspicion that her unconventional appearance at Lady Fairfax's assembly had been a deliberate choice rather than an inability to dress appropriately. Her gown of deep emerald silk had been cut in lines that flattered her generous figure whilst maintaining perfect propriety, and her dark hair had been arranged in a style that framed her face without resort to the elaborate confections favored by more fashionable young ladies. More significantly, she appeared to have abandoned her usual literary companion in favor of engaging with her family's guest according to the conventional requirements of polite society. The transformation was remarkable enough to suggest that her public reading habits represented rebellion rather than ignorance of proper behavior. She rose to offer him a curtsy that managed to convey both respect and a subtle hint of amusement, observing how brave he had been to venture forth on such an evening when lesser gentlemen might have sought refuge in their libraries rather than risk the perils of muddy country roads. His response that lesser gentlemen might have missed the opportunity for stimulating conversation prompted her observation that her devotion to Byron extended beyond public assemblies, though she suspected he would find her private literary opinions even more shocking than her public reading habits. The challenge implicit in her words was unmistakable, and Tristan felt that familiar quickening of interest that had characterized their previous encounter. Before he could pursue the matter further, however, the announcement of dinner interrupted their exchange, and they proceeded to the dining room according to the proper precedence that placed him at Lady Bellwether's right hand, whilst Miss Bellwether was relegated to the foot of the table. The meal that followed proved considerably more enjoyable than he had anticipated. Sir Barnaby possessed the sort of wide-ranging intellect that comes from extensive reading combined with practical experience managing rural concerns, whilst Lady Bellwether's nervous chatter revealed an unexpected familiarity with London society acquired during her own brief season some decades past. Miss Bellwether contributed to the conversation with an ease that suggested long practice in adult discourse, her observations displaying both wit and wisdom that belied her years. When Sir Barnaby mentioned recent developments in agricultural techniques, she demonstrated familiarity with crop rotation theories that would have impressed progressive landowners. Her comments on current political events revealed a grasp of parliamentary proceedings that exceeded that of most gentlemen Tristan knew. Yet it was her literary opinions that proved most intriguing. When the conversation turned to recent publications, she offered assessments of various authors that were both informed and original, her enthusiasm for certain works balanced by thoughtful criticism of others. Her defense of Gothic novels as legitimate literary entertainment despite their sensational subject matter displayed the sort of independent thinking that he had rarely encountered in feminine company. Tristan's observation that she seemed remarkably well-informed regarding masculine pursuits brought the response that her papa had never believed feminine education should be restricted to accomplishments designed merely to ornament the drawing room. He maintained that an intelligent woman denied intellectual stimulation became either a household tyrant or a confirmed invalid, neither of which would contribute to domestic happiness. When Tristan characterized this as a most progressive philosophy, Sir Barnaby added with rueful humor that it was progressive enough to render his daughter thoroughly unmarriageable, though he confessed himself unable to regret the decision. Imogen's conversation had provided him with more entertainment over the years than a dozen conventional daughters might have managed. The fond exchange between father and daughter revealed a domestic harmony that Tristan found unexpectedly appealing. His own family relationships were characterized by duty rather than affection, formal interactions governed by protocol rather than genuine sentiment. The easy intimacy displayed by the Bellwether family suggested possibilities he had never considered when contemplating his own eventual marriage. After dinner, Lady Bellwether suggested they repair to the drawing room for tea, a proposal that included an inquiry regarding Miss Bellwether's willingness to provide musical entertainment for their guest. The request was delivered with the sort of hopeful anxiety that suggested this represented one of the few conventional accomplishments in which her daughter had achieved reasonable proficiency. Miss Bellwether agreed with apparent delight, though something in her expression suggested that her definition of musical entertainment might not align precisely with her mother's expectations. The drawing room at Bellwether Manor reflected the same comfortable gentility that characterized the rest of the house. Well-worn furniture spoke of decades of use rather than recent acquisition, whilst the walls displayed an eclectic collection of paintings and prints that suggested personal preference rather than fashionable decoration. The pianoforte, whilst obviously well-maintained, bore the marks of extensive use rather than merely ornamental display. Miss Bellwether approached the instrument with the confidence of someone genuinely accomplished rather than merely adequate, her fingers finding the keys with practiced ease. Instead of the Italian songs or popular ballads that typically graced such domestic entertainments, however, she began to play a complex piece that Tristan recognized as one of Mozart's later sonatas. The music that filled the room possessed both technical brilliance and emotional depth, her interpretation revealing nuances that spoke of genuine musical understanding rather than mere mechanical execution. Her hands moved across the keyboard with graceful precision, her entire being absorbed in the creation of sound that transcended the usual boundaries of drawing room performance. When the piece concluded, the silence that followed spoke more eloquently than any amount of conventional praise could have managed. Tristan found himself genuinely moved by the experience, a sensation so unexpected that he required a moment to formulate an appropriate response. When he declared the performance extraordinary with unusual sincerity, her cheeks flushed with the exertion and excitement of performance as she confessed herself somewhat starved for audiences capable of appreciating music that extended beyond the usual repertoire of feminine accomplishments. His compliment regarding her remarkable skill for someone who claimed to lack conventional accomplishments prompted her observation that music represented one of the few areas where feminine excellence was permitted to exist without exciting masculine anxiety. A woman might display virtuosity at the pianoforte without threatening the natural order that required her to defer to masculine superiority in all intellectual pursuits. The observation was delivered with such matter-of-fact composure that it took Tristan a moment to recognize the subtle criticism it contained. Miss Bellwether had just suggested that society's restrictions on feminine achievement were both arbitrary and designed to protect masculine pride rather than preserve natural hierarchy. When he observed that she seemed to have given considerable thought to such social arrangements, she replied that living within those arrangements, whilst possessing capabilities they were designed to suppress, provided ample opportunity for reflection. Her dark eyes met his with that directness he was beginning to recognize as characteristic. Before he could pursue this fascinating line of inquiry further, Lady Bellwether interjected with a nervous laugh that suggested her daughter's conversation was venturing into territory she found alarming. Dear Imogen had such original ideas, she observed with the sort of indulgent tone typically reserved for harmless eccentricities, though she did worry that her reading habits encouraged thoughts that might be better left unexplored. Tristan's vehement assertion that he found her observations both intelligent and original surprised even himself. Society would benefit from more such independent thinking, rather than the endless repetition of conventional wisdom, he insisted with unusual force. The defense was instinctive and immediate, motivated by something deeper than mere politeness. Miss Bellwether's expression of surprised gratitude suggested that such support was rare enough to be memorable, whilst her parents exchanged glances that spoke of both pleasure and concern at this unexpected championship of their daughter's unconventional nature. The remainder of the evening passed in similarly stimulating conversation, ranging from literature to politics to philosophy, with an ease that Tristan had never experienced in feminine company. Miss Bellwether proved capable of holding her own in discussions that would have challenged most gentlemen of his acquaintance, her contributions marked by both intelligence and wit that made the time pass with alarming rapidity. When the evening finally drew to its close and he prepared to take his leave, Tristan realized with something approaching shock that he had spent the entire evening in the company of a respectable young lady without once being bored, condescended to, or required to feign interest in topics that held no appeal for him. More troubling still was the recognition that he looked forward to their next encounter with an anticipation that had nothing to do with his father's matrimonial ultimatum and everything to do with his own growing fascination with the most unconventional young lady he had ever encountered. As his curricle wheels splashed through the muddy lanes that led back to Winterbourne Hall, Tristan found himself contemplating the dangerous possibility that his father's demand for marriage might be fulfilled in a manner that neither of them had anticipated. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it produced a curious warmth that had nothing to do with the carriage lanterns and everything to do with dark eyes and intelligent conversation that promised depths yet to be explored. 3 weeks of determined courtship had established a pattern that both participants found increasingly comfortable despite its unconventional nature. Tristan discovered himself inventing excuses to call at Bellwether Manor with a frequency that would have raised eyebrows had anyone besides the principals been paying close attention to his movements. Fortunately, local society remained sufficiently distracted by the spectacle of Miss Charlotte Fairfax's apparent conquest of young Lord Hartwell to notice that the notorious Lord Tristan was conducting a decidedly intellectual courtship of the neighborhood's most confirmed bluestocking. Their encounters had evolved beyond the constraints of formal visiting hours into something approaching genuine friendship. Miss Bellwether proved to be exactly the sort of companion he had never realized he craved. Intelligent enough to challenge his opinions, well-read enough to discuss literature with genuine insight, and possessed of sufficient wit to transform even mundane topics into sources of entertainment. More significantly, she appeared to enjoy his company with the same uncomplicated pleasure he derived from hers. Their conversations ranged across subjects that would have horrified conventional young ladies, from the radical politics espoused by certain contemporary poets to the philosophical implications of recent scientific discoveries. She neither simpered at his wit nor pretended to defer to his superior masculine understanding of complex issues. Instead, she argued with him when she disagreed, laughed at his jokes when they genuinely amused her, and shared her own observations with the confidence of someone accustomed to having her opinions valued rather than dismissed. The experience was so novel and so thoroughly agreeable that Tristan found himself postponing the moment when he would be required to transform their friendship into something resembling conventional courtship. The transformation, when it came, was precipitated by an encounter he had not anticipated and was entirely unprepared to handle with his usual sophisticated detachment. Lord Hartwell's successful courtship of Miss Charlotte Fairfax had culminated in an engagement that required celebration according to the prescribed rituals of rural society. Lady Fairfax, in a transport of maternal triumph, had organized an elaborate garden party designed to showcase both her daughter's happiness and her own social connections. The entire neighborhood had been invited to witness this testimony to her successful matchmaking abilities, and Tristan attended the festivities with every intention of maintaining his careful balance between social obligation and personal inclination. He would congratulate the happy couple with appropriate enthusiasm, exchange pleasantries with various local worthies, and seek out Miss Bellwether for whatever stimulating conversation might be achieved within the constraints of such a public gathering. The plan was perfectly reasonable and should have proceeded without incident. Unfortunately, it failed to account for the presence of certain London acquaintances who had travelled into Gloucestershire specifically to attend the celebration. His old friend appeared at his elbow whilst he was observing the elaborate refreshment table that Lady Fairfax had arranged beneath a series of striped pavilions designed to evoke vaguely oriental splendour. The gentleman's presence was not entirely unwelcome, though it did represent a complication he had not anticipated. His friend exclaimed with the hearty bonhomie that characterized their London relationship, noting that this was where he had been hiding himself these past weeks. A mutual acquaintance had mentioned that he had vanished from all the usual haunts, but everyone had assumed he was pursuing some new form of debauchery rather than playing at rustic respectability. The explanation that followed revealed his friend was present at the specific request of his dear mamma, who maintained correspondence with Lady Fairfax despite having no earthly use for her in general society. Maternal duty occasionally required sacrifices that would otherwise be unthinkable, he observed with characteristic irreverence, though Tristan detected an undercurrent of genuine affection beneath the theatrical complaint. When asked how he found the provincial entertainments, his friend replied with diplomatic precision that they were charming in their simplicity, though he confessed himself curious about the attractions that had kept Tristan away from London for so extended a period. Surely the local offerings could not compare to the sophisticated pleasures available at White's or the more exclusive establishments they typically frequented. The question was casual enough, but Tristan recognized the genuine curiosity that motivated it. His friends had every reason to wonder what could possibly have induced him to abandon his usual pursuits in favor of country society and respectable entertainments. His careful explanation that his father had developed certain expectations regarding his immediate future brought understanding that the parental marriage ultimatum had finally arrived. When his friend inquired whether he had selected his sacrificial lamb or was still surveying the local flocks, the crude phrasing struck Tristan as suddenly offensive in this context. The reduction of marriage to a transaction requiring a sacrificial lamb seemed both callous and inaccurate when applied to his current circumstances. His stiff response that the matter remained under consideration prompted enthusiastic approval and a request for guidance regarding the local beauties. His friend expressed particular intrigue regarding the brunette in the corner, who appeared to be holding court among the elderly ladies rather than fluttering after eligible gentlemen. Tristan followed his gaze with growing alarm to where Miss Bellwether sat surrounded by several dowagers whose appreciation for intelligent conversation had led them to seek her company despite her unconventional reputation. She wore a gown of pale yellow that complemented her dark coloring, and her animated discussion with Mrs. Hartwell regarding some point of natural philosophy had attracted the attention of several other guests. When Tristan identified her as Miss Bellwether, his friend's eyebrows rose with interest. Sir Barnaby's daughter? He had heard the most extraordinary rumors about her intellectual pretensions. They said she read Latin and corresponded with Oxford scholars regarding matters of classical translation. Tristan's admission that she was indeed remarkably well educated prompted his friend's observation that he had always found bluestockings intriguing creatures. Their pretensions to learning created such delicious opportunities for masculine correction, he noted with a tone that revealed casual cruelty masked as sophisticated banter. The observation struck Tristan like a physical blow. In London, such remarks had seemed merely part of the sophisticated discourse that characterized their social circle. Here, applied to Miss Bellwether specifically, they revealed an ugliness that he found suddenly intolerable. His heated advice against pursuing that particular line of inquiry prompted amused speculation about his unexpected protectiveness. Unless he could not possibly be considering the bluestocking for his own matrimonial purposes. The question hung between them with the weight of years of shared assumptions about feminine desirability and masculine requirements. In their London circle, the notion of marrying for intellectual compatibility rather than beauty, fortune, or social advancement would have been regarded as either comic or tragic, depending upon one's perspective. Tristan's careful assertion that Miss Bellwether possessed many admirable qualities brought agreement that she certainly did, though his friend confessed surprise that he would consider such qualities sufficient compensation for her obvious disadvantages. Surely his father's requirements extended to more conventional feminine attractions. Before Tristan could formulate a response that might discourage further speculation without revealing the extent of his own confusion regarding Miss Bellwether, they were joined by two other London acquaintances whose presence transformed the conversation into something approaching a social tribunal. The newcomers had apparently arrived in Gloucestershire as part of the same maternal expedition that had brought their mutual friend to Lady Fairfax's celebration. Their appearance at this particular moment seemed designed by malicious fate to complicate matters that were already sufficiently confused. One exclaimed with excessive enthusiasm that suggested he had already sampled Lady Fairfax's punch bowl with some thoroughness, noting that their friend had been regaling them with tales of Tristan's rustic transformation. They had come to witness this miraculous conversion from sophisticated rake to country gentleman with their own eyes. The other observed with dry wit that the transformation appeared less complete than advertised, though he understood that an attachment to local intellectual society had developed. The three men exchanged glances that spoke of years of shared experience in evaluating feminine attractions according to criteria that suddenly seemed both shallow and cruel. Their assumption that his interest in Miss Bellwether represented either temporary madness or elaborate jest was implicit in their every word and gesture. When Tristan protested that they mistook his circumstances, one inquired with mock innocence whether he would care to enlighten them regarding the true nature of his rural pursuits. The challenge was delivered with the sort of casual cruelty that their London circle regarded as sophisticated wit. In that context, such exchanges represented acceptable entertainment among equals who understood the rules governing their social interactions. Here, applied to circumstances they could not comprehend, their familiar banter revealed assumptions that made Tristan suddenly ashamed of his own participation in such conversations. His cold response that his pursuits were his own concern should have warned them against further provocation. Unfortunately, alcohol and group dynamics combined to overcome whatever caution they might ordinarily have displayed. The conversation that followed represented a masterclass in the sort of casual masculine cruelty that reduces feminine worth to a series of calculations based upon beauty, fortune, and social utility. Miss Bellwether's intellectual accomplishments were dismissed as pretentious affectation designed to compensate for her failure to attract masculine attention through conventional means. Her appearance was subjected to detailed analysis that found her figure too generous and her complexion too unfashionably healthy for refined taste. Her family's modest circumstances were noted with the sort of patronizing sympathy typically reserved for objects of charity. Each jest, each shared laugh at Imogen's expense sounded to Tristan like breaking glass. The very words he himself might have uttered in London only weeks before now seemed grotesque to him, the language of a barbarous tribe of which he no longer felt himself a member. Worst of all, their speculations regarding his own motives transformed their acquaintance into a source of entertainment that reduced both participants to comic figures worthy of ridicule rather than respect. The sophisticated rake dallying with a provincial bluestocking whilst fulfilling parental demands for respectable marriage provided material for the sort of anecdotes that would enliven London dinner parties for months to come. Tristan endured this character assassination with growing fury, trapped between his loyalty to long-standing friendships and his increasing certainty that Miss Bellwether deserved protection from such casual malice. His attempts to redirect the conversation proved futile, his friends interpreting his objections as evidence of temporary infatuation that required correction rather than respect. The situation reached its crisis when one suggested that they should make Miss Bellwether's acquaintance themselves, ostensibly to evaluate her intellectual pretensions through direct examination. The proposal was delivered with the sort of smiling malice that promised entertainment at her expense rather than genuine social courtesy. Tristan's vehement refusal surprised even himself in its intensity. When asked why he objected to introducing his friends to the object of his current fascination, he replied with dangerous quiet that Miss Bellwether was a respectable young lady entitled to protection from unwelcome attention. The gallant response prompted murmured observations about his unprecedented protectiveness, though curiosity remained regarding what form such protection might require. The implication was unmistakable. They viewed his defense of Miss Bellwether as evidence of serious attachment rather than basic courtesy. Worse still, their amusement at this possibility suggested they found the notion of such attachment inherently ridiculous. The recognition that his London friends regarded his growing feelings for Miss Bellwether as either temporary madness or elaborate comedy struck him with devastating clarity. If sophisticated gentlemen who knew him intimately could not conceive of his forming a genuine attachment to someone like her, what hope did such an attachment have of surviving the broader scrutiny of society? The thought of Miss Bellwether subjected to the sort of casual cruelty he had just witnessed filled him with protective fury. Yet beneath that anger lay a more troubling realization. He was not prepared to defend their relationship against such attacks because he was not certain of its nature himself. Was his interest in her conversation merely the novelty of encountering genuine intelligence in feminine form? Did his pleasure in her company represent anything more significant than relief from the tedium of conventional courtship? Most troubling of all, was he unconsciously using her intellectual gifts to convince himself that marrying for convenience rather than love might prove bearable after all? The questions tormented him throughout the remainder of the garden party. His distraction, so obvious that even his obtuse friends eventually ceased their speculations and turned their attention to less controversial entertainment. He performed his social duties with mechanical precision, whilst his thoughts churned with doubts that had not existed before their arrival. When he finally managed to approach Miss Bellwether for their customary conversation, she greeted him with the warm smile that had become precious to him over the past weeks. Her obvious pleasure in his company only intensified his growing sense of guilt regarding his own motivations. Her observation that he seemed unusually subdued that afternoon, delivered with the perceptive accuracy that characterized her assessment of his moods, included gentle inquiry about whether his London friends had brought unwelcome news. The sensitivity she displayed, showing genuine interest in his welfare without demanding confidences he might not wish to share, demonstrated exactly the sort of consideration that had drawn him to her company. She possessed the rare gift of caring about his circumstances without the possessive curiosity that typically characterized feminine attention. When he replied carefully that the news was not unwelcome precisely, though their presence had provided food for thought regarding certain matters he had not previously considered, her understanding response suggested she had observed more of his afternoon's discomfort than he had realized. Her observation that old friends often served as unwelcome mirrors, reflecting aspects of ourselves we might prefer to forget, was so perfectly apt that he stared at her in amazement. How had she managed to identify the source of his disturbance with such precision? More troubling still, what did her insight suggest about the transparency of his own emotional state? When he noted that she seemed remarkably well-informed regarding the complexities of masculine friendship, she replied with characteristic directness that she was well-informed regarding the complexities of human nature. Masculine friendship merely represented one variation on themes that applied to all social relationships. Before he could pursue this fascinating line of inquiry, Lady Fairfax's voice rang across the garden, announcing that the afternoon's festivities were drawing to their close. The moment for private conversation had passed, leaving him with more questions than answers regarding both his own feelings and her perception of their developing relationship. As he took his leave of the Bellwether family, Tristan found himself studying Miss Bellwether's expression for any sign that she had detected the afternoon's undercurrents of social calculation and emotional uncertainty. Her farewell was warm but not possessive, friendly but not presumptuous, exactly the sort of balanced courtesy he had come to expect from her. Yet something in her dark eyes suggested awareness of complications she chose not to address directly. The recognition that she might understand his situation better than he understood it himself was both comforting and deeply unsettling. The journey back to Winterbourne Hall passed in contemplation of questions that had no comfortable answers. His London friend's casual dismissal of Miss Bellwether's worth had forced him to confront the possibility that his interest in her might be motivated by factors other than genuine affection. More troubling still was the growing certainty that she deserved far better than to serve as his convenient solution to an inconvenient ultimatum. The thought of her discovering that his courtship had begun as a calculated response to paternal pressure rather than genuine attraction filled him with a shame so acute that he could barely endure it. By the time he reached Winterbourne Hall, one conclusion had crystallized from the afternoon's emotional turmoil. Miss Bellwether's happiness and reputation were too precious to be sacrificed to his own convenience. If he could not offer her the sort of devoted love she deserved, then honor demanded he withdraw from her society before his attentions raised expectations he was not prepared to fulfill. The decision, once made, brought no relief, only a hollowness that suggested his feelings might be deeper than he had been willing to acknowledge. But it was too late for such recognition. The damage was done, and the only honorable course was to retreat before that damage became irreparable. The irony was not lost on him that in attempting to protect her from his own uncertain motives, he might be destroying the one relationship that had brought genuine happiness into his carefully orchestrated life of sophisticated dissipation. For 3 days, he isolated himself at Winterbourne Hall until a note from Bellwether Manor shattered his seclusion. The news of Imogen's genuine concern for his welfare acted like lightning, dispelling all confusion. It was not convenience, nor curiosity. The anguish he felt at the thought of losing her was unmistakable. He was, to his complete panic, in love with her, and if he loved her, he owed her the truth, however terrible the consequences might be. The discovery should have simplified his situation. If he loved her genuinely, then surely his courtship was not the mercenary pursuit his London friends had suggested. Instead, it complicated matters beyond all reasonable hope of resolution. For if he truly loved her, how could he ask her to accept a proposal motivated by his father's ultimatum rather than freely chosen devotion? More troubling still was the question of whether such love was reciprocated. Miss Bellwether enjoyed his company, appreciated his conversation, and appeared to value their friendship. But did her feelings extend beyond intellectual companionship toward the sort of romantic attachment that might overcome her obvious reluctance to embrace conventional marriage? The uncertainty tormented him throughout a sleepless night, spent pacing his chambers while rain drummed against the windows with monotonous persistence. By dawn, one conclusion had emerged from the chaos of his emotional state. He owed Miss Bellwether the truth about his circumstances, regardless of the consequences. She deserved to know that his courtship had begun as a calculated response to paternal pressure, that his initial interest in her conversation had been motivated by curiosity rather than attraction, and that his growing attachment to her company had surprised him as much as it might surprise her. Armed with such knowledge, she could make an informed decision about whether to encourage or discourage his continued attentions. The resolution brought no peace, only a grim determination to behave with the honor that his recent conduct had conspicuously lacked. If Miss Bellwether chose to terminate their acquaintance after learning the truth about his motivations, he would accept her decision with whatever grace he could muster. If she preferred to maintain their friendship whilst discouraging romantic expectations, he would endeavor to be satisfied with whatever relationship she was prepared to offer. The possibility that she might respond with understanding and forgiveness seemed too remote to contemplate. Yet he found himself clinging to such hope with the desperation of a drowning man grasping at floating debris. His decision to visit Bellwether Manor that very afternoon was complicated by the arrival of his father at the breakfast table, a departure from routine that suggested matters of significance were afoot. The Marquis rarely emerged from his private study before noon, preferring to conduct his correspondence and estate business in splendid isolation from family obligations. His appearance in the breakfast parlor, therefore, carried ominous implications that were confirmed by his first words. Lady Fairfax had paid a morning call the previous day, ostensibly to thank him for his son's attendance at her daughter's engagement celebration. In the course of their conversation, however, she had made several observations regarding Tristan's apparent interest in a certain young lady whose circumstances might not align with his family's expectations. The Marquis's tone remained carefully neutral as he outlined Lady Fairfax's concerns, but Tristan detected the steel beneath his diplomatic phrasing. Miss Bellwether was, by all accounts, a perfectly respectable young lady of adequate breeding and modest accomplishments. However, her reputation for intellectual pretension and her family's limited financial resources made her an unsuitable choice for the son of a marquis, regardless of his position in the succession. When Tristan attempted to defend Miss Bellwether's character and accomplishments, his father's expression hardened into the implacable resolve that had characterized their previous interview. He had no quarrel with the young lady personally, but he had not rescued his son from the corrupting influences of London society only to see him make a marriage that would provide fresh scandal for the ton's entertainment. The ultimatum was delivered with devastating clarity. Tristan would either select a bride from among the conventionally eligible young ladies available in local society, or he would face the consequences of continued defiance. The threat of disinheritance remained in force, and no amount of romantic attachment to unsuitable candidates would alter his father's determination to see his younger son respectably settled. The interview concluded with instructions to attend Lady Thornfield's upcoming evening party, where he would have ample opportunity to demonstrate his commitment to appropriate matrimonial choices. His failure to appear would be interpreted as continued rebellion against paternal authority, with all the consequences such rebellion entailed. Left alone in the breakfast parlor, Tristan found himself confronting the full magnitude of his predicament. His father's opposition to Miss Bellwether was not merely the result of Lady Fairfax's meddling. It reflected the deeply ingrained prejudices of a society that valued birth and fortune above all other considerations. Even if Miss Bellwether were willing to accept his proposal despite learning the truth about his initial motivations, their marriage would subject her to exactly the sort of social scrutiny and subtle ostracism that he had witnessed at Lady Fairfax's garden party. His London friend's casual cruelty would seem mild compared to the systematic campaign of exclusion that would greet a young lady who dared to marry above her station without the compensating advantages of extraordinary beauty or wealth. The recognition that loving Miss Bellwether might require protecting her from the consequences of that love struck him with devastating force. If he truly cared for her welfare, perhaps the kindest course would be to withdraw from her society entirely, allowing her to seek happiness with someone whose circumstances would not expose her to social persecution. Yet the thought of such noble sacrifice provided no comfort, only a hollow sense of loss that seemed to echo through his entire being. How had he allowed himself to reach such a point that every available option led to misery for one or both of the parties involved? The answer, when it came, brought with it a clarity that had been missing from all his previous deliberations. He had fallen in love precisely because Miss Bellwether possessed qualities that transcended the superficial attractions valued by fashionable society. Her intelligence, her independence, her refusal to pretend deference to masculine superiority, these were the very characteristics that made her both unsuitable as a conventional wife and precious beyond measure as a companion for life. If he abandoned her now to protect her from social disapproval, he would be betraying everything that had drawn him to her in the first place. More importantly, he would be denying her the right to make her own decision about whether their love was worth whatever challenges it might entail. The resolution that crystallized from this recognition was both simple and terrifying. He would tell Miss Bellwether the complete truth about his circumstances, offer her his heart without reservation, and allow her to determine their future based on full knowledge of what such a future might entail. If she chose to reject him, he would accept her decision and face his father's ultimatum with whatever consequences followed. If she chose to accept him, they would confront together whatever obstacles society placed in their path. The prospect of such honesty was more frightening than any physical danger he had ever faced, yet it brought with it a sense of liberation that he had not experienced since his arrival in Gloucestershire. For the first time in months, he would be acting from genuine conviction rather than calculated expediency. The afternoon's journey to Bellwether Manor passed in a blur of nervous anticipation that made the short distance seem interminable. When he finally arrived at the familiar manor house, his hands were trembling slightly as he handed his reins to the groom, a physical manifestation of emotional turmoil that would have amused his London associates had they been present to witness it. Sir Barnaby received him with obvious relief, expressing pleasure at seeing him abroad again after his recent indisposition. The older gentleman's manner suggested genuine affection that made Tristan's deception all the more shameful, yet also provided hope that honest confession might be received with understanding rather than outrage. Lady Bellwether fluttered about him with anxious solicitude, pressing refreshments upon him whilst expressing concern for his health and inquiring whether his London friends had brought disturbing news about family matters. Her obvious assumption that his absence had been motivated by circumstances beyond his control made his actual motivations seem even more contemptible. Miss Bellwether's entrance into the drawing room brought with it the now familiar sensation of breathlessness that had become his body's involuntary response to her presence. She wore a simple morning dress of lavender muslin that complemented her dark coloring, and her expression combined obvious pleasure at seeing him with a hint of the concern that had prompted her father's note. Her greeting was warm but contained a subtle reserve that suggested his recent absence had not gone unnoticed or unanalyzed. When she inquired about his health with genuine solicitude, the kindness in her voice made his planned confession seem both more necessary and more difficult to accomplish. The usual pattern of their visits was disrupted by his inability to concentrate on the conventional pleasantries that typically preceded their more substantial conversations. Sir Barnaby's observations about the weather and Lady Bellwether's anxious commentary on household matters passed over him like background noise, his attention focused entirely on the young lady whose future happiness might depend upon the words he was preparing to speak. Miss Bellwether appeared to sense his distraction, her perceptive gaze studying his countenance with the sort of careful attention she typically reserved for particularly complex literary passages. When a momentary lull in the general conversation presented itself, she suggested that perhaps Lord Tristan might enjoy seeing her father's latest addition to his library, a first edition of Dryden's works that had recently been acquired through a London book dealer. The suggestion was clearly designed to provide them with the privacy necessary for more personal discourse, and Tristan accepted with grateful alacrity. Sir Barnaby's enthusiastic endorsement of the proposal suggested that he too had recognized the undercurrents of tension in the drawing room and welcomed any opportunity to resolve them. The library at Bellwether Manor reflected its owner's genuine love of learning rather than any desire to impress visitors with fashionable literary displays. Books filled every available surface, their well-worn bindings speaking of frequent consultation rather than merely ornamental presence. The room's comfortable disorder created an atmosphere of scholarly intimacy that had made it the natural setting for many of their most engaging conversations. Miss Bellwether moved to the window overlooking the manor's modest gardens, her posture suggesting that she was prepared to listen to whatever revelation had prompted his unusual behavior. The afternoon light streaming through the casement windows highlighted the intelligent animation of her features whilst casting her figure into soft relief against the pale curtains. For a moment that stretched into uncomfortable silence, Tristan found himself unable to begin the confession that had seemed so necessary during his sleepless deliberations. The reality of potentially losing her good opinion, of seeing her warm regard transform into disappointment or disgust, proved more daunting than any theoretical consideration of consequences. Miss Bellwether's patient silence, free from the demanding curiosity that might have characterized a less perceptive woman, finally provided him with the courage to speak. Her willingness to wait for his explanation rather than pressing for immediate answers demonstrated once again the consideration that had drawn him to her company. He began haltingly, explaining that his recent absence had been prompted not by illness or family concerns, but by disturbing realizations about his own motivations and character. The encounter with his London friends had forced him to confront truths about himself that were both uncomfortable and shameful to acknowledge. As he spoke, her expression remained attentively neutral, neither encouraging nor discouraging his continued revelations. When he explained that his initial courtship had been motivated by his father's matrimonial ultimatum rather than genuine romantic interest, she showed no sign of the shock or indignation he had anticipated. Instead, she observed with characteristic directness that she had suspected as much from their first conversation. His references to filial duty and condemned men choosing their execution had been rather revealing, she noted with a slight smile that suggested amusement rather than offense. Her calm acceptance of what he had expected to be a devastating revelation emboldened him to continue with the more difficult aspects of his confession. He explained how his initial calculation had gradually transformed into something deeper and more genuine, how her intelligence and independence had challenged his assumptions about feminine nature and masculine requirements. When he admitted that he had come to love her with an intensity that frightened him precisely because it was so unexpected and so completely outside his previous experience, her expression softened into something that might have been wonder. Her response, when it came, demonstrated the sort of emotional honesty that had characterized all their interactions. She confessed that she had recognized his initial motivations, but had chosen to encourage his attentions anyway, hoping that friendship might eventually develop into something more substantial. Her own feelings had undergone a similar transformation, she explained with touching vulnerability. What had begun as intellectual curiosity about the notorious Lord Tristan had evolved into an attachment so deep that his recent absence had caused her genuine distress. The admission that her feelings paralleled his own brought a relief so profound that Tristan felt physically weakened by its intensity. Yet even as joy flooded through him, responsibility demanded that he explain the full implications of what such mutual attachment might entail. His father's opposition to their union was absolute, he explained with painful honesty. The Marquis would never accept a daughter-in-law whose circumstances did not meet his exacting social requirements. Marriage to her would mean disinheritance, social ostracism, and the sort of financial uncertainty that might make their love seem less romantic and more burdensome as the years progressed. More troubling still was the recognition that she would bear the brunt of society's disapproval. His friend's casual cruelty at Lady Fairfax's garden party represented merely a sample of the systematic exclusion and subtle humiliation that would greet a young lady who dared to marry above her station without the compensating advantages of extraordinary beauty or wealth. Miss Bellwether listened to this catalogue of obstacles with the same calm attention she had shown throughout his confession. When he finished speaking, she moved closer to where he stood beside her father's desk, her proximity making his heart race with possibilities he dared not yet contemplate. Her response revealed depths of courage and determination that humbled him, even as they filled him with admiration. She had spent her entire life being judged unsuitable by conventional standards, she observed with characteristic precision. Society's disapproval held no terrors for someone who had already been labeled a bluestocking, a spinster, and an object of pity. As for financial considerations, she had always expected to live modestly, whether as her father's dependent daughter or as companion to some elderly relative. The prospect of sharing such modest circumstances with a man she loved seemed preferable to comfort without affection. Her greatest concern, she continued with touching directness, was not society's reaction to their marriage, but his eventual regret at having sacrificed his inheritance and social position for a woman whose unconventional nature would continue to provide sources of embarrassment throughout their married life. The suggestion that he might come to regret choosing her struck Tristan as so fundamentally wrong that he found himself responding with passionate conviction rather than careful deliberation. How could he regret a choice that had already brought him more happiness than all his years of sophisticated dissipation combined? Her intelligence, her independence, her refusal to pretend deference she did not feel. These were not flaws to be overlooked, but gifts to be treasured. If society chose to disapprove of such qualities, then society revealed its own limitations rather than hers. The declaration seemed to surprise her with its vehemence, and for the first time since entering the library, her composed facade showed signs of the emotion she had been carefully controlling. When she asked whether he was certain he could accept the consequences of choosing love over duty, her voice carried a tremor that suggested how much his answer meant to her. His response required no deliberation. The certainty that filled him was absolute and immediate. He would rather face poverty and exile with her than enjoy wealth and position without her. If she would accept him, despite the difficulties their union would entail, he would spend the rest of his life ensuring that she never regretted her courage in accepting his proposal. The kiss that followed was gentle and tentative, a question rather than a demand, seeking permission rather than claiming privilege. When she responded with warmth that matched his own, the sensation was so overwhelming that he understood for the first time why poets wrote of hearts stopping and worlds shifting on their foundations. When they finally separated, both breathless and slightly dazed by the intensity of their mutual response, Miss Bellwether observed with characteristic wit that they would need to inform her parents of their understanding before the household began to speculate about why they required such extended privacy for examining her father's book collection. The practical observation, delivered with the sort of gentle humor that had endeared her to him from their first meeting, served to restore some semblance of rationality to proceedings that had been conducted entirely according to the dictates of emotion. Yet as they prepared to rejoin her parents and formally announce their engagement, Tristan found himself marveling at the transformation that had occurred within the space of a single afternoon. He had entered the library burdened by guilt and uncertainty, expecting at best to secure Miss Bellwether's forgiveness for his deception. Instead, he had discovered that love freely given and honestly acknowledged possessed the power to transform even the most daunting obstacles into challenges that could be met with confidence and grace. The future that stretched before them would undoubtedly contain difficulties that neither could fully anticipate, but they would face those difficulties together, armed with the sort of mutual devotion that made any sacrifice seem not only bearable, but worthwhile. The announcement of their engagement to Sir Barnaby and Lady Bellwether produced reactions that ranged from delighted surprise to anxious concern about the practical implications of such an unexpected union. Sir Barnaby's immediate blessing was accompanied by heartfelt expressions of gratitude that his beloved daughter had found a gentleman capable of appreciating her true worth, whilst Lady Bellwether's pleasure was tempered by maternal worries about the social challenges such a marriage might entail. The evening that followed passed in a blur of earnest discussions about wedding preparations, financial arrangements, and the delicate matter of how to present their union to both local society and Tristan's formidable father. Miss Bellwether, or rather his affianced bride, as he was now entitled to think of her, contributed to these deliberations with the same practical intelligence she applied to all complex problems, her suggestions both sensible and surprisingly well-informed regarding the legal and social intricacies involved. It was she who proposed that they marry by special license rather than endure the 3 weeks of bans that would provide ample opportunity for interference from disapproving relatives or meddling neighbors. The expense of such an arrangement was justified, she argued with characteristic directness, by the need to present the Marquis with an accomplished fact rather than a proposed action he might feel compelled to prevent. Her understanding of masculine pride and paternal authority impressed Tristan even as it reminded him of the formidable intelligence he was gaining along with her affections. A conventional young lady might have insisted upon the full ceremonial celebration that marked most marriages of their social class. Miss Bellwether recognized that discretion and speed were their most valuable allies in the current circumstances. The interview with his father, when it could no longer be postponed, proved every bit as difficult as Tristan had anticipated. The Marquis received the news of his son's engagement with icy composure that was far more alarming than any display of temper might have been. His questions regarding Miss Bellwether's family connections and financial circumstances were delivered with the sort of clinical precision typically reserved for examining livestock at market. When Tristan attempted to defend his choice by describing his bride's accomplishments and character, his father's response was devastating in its calculated cruelty. He had not rescued his son from London's corrupting influences, only to see him make a marriage that would provide fresh entertainment for every drawing room in England. The family's reputation could not survive another scandal, particularly one that involved rejecting eligible young ladies in favor of a provincial bluestocking whose pretensions exceeded her circumstances. The Marquis leaned forward, his voice dropping to an icy whisper. "Your great-uncle made the same mistake, married for passion, and brought ruin upon his branch of the family. I will not see history repeat itself with my blood. You will make a choice, and you will make it now." The ultimatum was delivered with implacable finality. Tristan could choose between his inheritance and his infatuation, but he could not have both. Marriage to Miss Bellwether would result in immediate disinheritance and permanent estrangement from his family. His quarterly allowance would cease, his expectations regarding future support would be nullified, and his name would be removed from all family documents. The threat was not delivered in anger, but with the cold calculation of a man accustomed to having his will obeyed without question. The Marquis had already consulted with his solicitors regarding the legal mechanisms required to ensure his younger son's complete financial independence, and he was prepared to implement such measures immediately upon receiving confirmation of the marriage. Tristan's response surprised even himself with its calm determination. He thanked his father for his honesty regarding the consequences of his choice, whilst expressing regret that their relationship must be sacrificed to preserve family pride. His decision, however, was irrevocable. He would marry Miss Bellwether regardless of the personal cost, because a life without her seemed more terrible than any external hardship they might face together. The interview concluded with formal courtesy that barely concealed mutual disappointment and anger. Father and son parted with the understanding that they might never speak again as family members, though both maintained the fiction that time might eventually heal wounds that seemed permanently damaging. The wedding ceremony itself took place in the small parish church that had served the Bellwether family for generations, its ancient stones bearing witness to countless unions that had endured through decades of triumph and tribulation. The congregation was necessarily limited to immediate family and a few close friends whose discretion could be trusted to preserve the privacy both bride and groom desired. Miss Bellwether, now Lady Tristan Caldwell, wore a gown of ivory silk that had belonged to her grandmother, its simple elegance more becoming than any elaborate creation from London's most fashionable modistes. Her only ornament was a string of pearls that had been her mother's wedding gift, their lustrous simplicity perfectly complementing the quiet radiance that transformed her entire countenance. The vows they exchanged carried weight that extended far beyond the traditional promises of mutual devotion and support. Each word represented a conscious choice to value love above convenience, principle above profit, and personal happiness above social approval. When Tristan promised to forsake all others in her favor, both understood that the forsaking included not merely other women, but the entire world of privilege and position into which he had been born. When she promised to honor and obey him according to God's holy ordinance, her slight smile suggested private amusement at the conventional phrasing that bore so little resemblance to the relationship of intellectual equality they had already established. The kiss that sealed their union was gentle and restrained, appropriate to their sacred surroundings, whilst promising depths of passion that would be explored in the privacy of their shared future. The wedding breakfast that followed was hosted at Bellwether Manor with the sort of modest elegance that characterized all the family's entertainments. The menu was simple but perfectly prepared. The decorations consisted of flowers from the manor's own gardens, and the atmosphere was marked by genuine joy rather than social obligation. Sir Barnaby's toast to the bride and groom expressed the heartfelt gratitude of a father who had never expected to see his unconventional daughter find happiness within the institution of marriage. Lady Bellwether's tears were those of maternal emotion rather than sorrow, her obvious delight in her daughter's choice serving to validate the wisdom of their decision. The small assembly of guests included several neighbors whose friendship had proved stronger than social convention, their presence providing evidence that true affection could overcome even the most rigid class distinctions. Mrs. Hartwell's attendance, despite her daughter's hopes of securing Lord Tristan for herself, demonstrated the sort of gracious acceptance that spoke well of local society's capacity for kindness. The absence of any representative from Winterbourne Hall was noted, but not discussed, the empty place that might have been occupied by the groom's father serving as silent reminder of the price their happiness had required. Yet the warmth of the Bellwether family's embrace seemed to compensate for the coldness they had encountered elsewhere. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the manor's gardens, the newly married couple prepared to depart for their wedding journey. A modest tour of the Lake District that would provide both the privacy needed for intimate adjustment to their new relationship and the scenic beauty that might inspire the sort of romantic poetry Miss Bellwether had always admired. Their carriage was packed with the essential belongings that would accompany them to their new life, including the trunk of books that represented her most precious possessions and his portable writing desk, where he had already begun composing the letters that would seek employment suitable to a gentleman reduced to earning his own living. The challenges that awaited them were real and substantial. Tristan's modest inheritance from his grandmother would provide temporary security, but it would not sustain them indefinitely without supplement from other sources. His education and natural abilities might eventually secure a position in government service or legal practice. But such careers required time to establish and offered uncertain prospects for advancement. Yet as their carriage rolled away from Bellwether Manor toward the uncertain future they had chosen together, neither bride nor groom experienced any regret for the decisions that had brought them to this moment. The love they had discovered in each other was worth any sacrifice, any struggle, any temporary hardship that circumstances might require. Miss Bellwether, Lady Tristan now, though she had laughingly insisted that such formality seemed absurd between them, had surprised him by revealing that her own small inheritance from a maiden aunt might be combined with his resources to purchase a modest property where they could establish their independent household. Her practical approach to their financial circumstances was matched by romantic dreams of a library where they might pursue their shared literary interests without regard for society's expectations. The future that stretched before them was uncertain in its details, but absolutely clear in its essential character. They would build their happiness upon foundations of mutual respect, intellectual compatibility, and passion that had already proved strong enough to overcome every obstacle placed in its path. As their carriage rolled toward an uncertain future, Tristan reflected upon the extraordinary transformation that had occurred since his father's ultimatum had driven him into Gloucestershire exile. He had arrived expecting a marriage of convenience, but found a love that redefined his existence. The woman beside him had given him more than her hand. She had given him a new understanding of life, lived with honesty and courage. The sacrifices of wealth and position, which once would have seemed unthinkable, now appeared trivial compared to the richness of sharing life with her. The cynical libertine was gone, replaced by a man whose greatest pleasure lay in the simple act of making his beloved wife smile. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society.